have to say that I never imagined when I stood for election to the Dáil for the second time in 2011 that I would find myself here just 2 years later speaking on a government-sponsored bill to liberalise abortion law in Ireland. I'm in no doubt by now that this legislation will pass, notwithstanding the many reservations expressed both privately and publicly by colleagues from all parties. Indeed, in the face of grave reservations expressed by expert psychiatrists in 2 separate sessions of Oireachtas Health Committee hearings. I can only hope that logic and verifiable evidence will prevail and substantive amendments will be accepted to ensure that the rights of all human beings are protected with the full rigour of the law. I've never regarded myself as a pro-life campaigner. I was not motivated to become active in politics because of the abortion issue. In fact, I've spoken previously about the fact that I had a very different view on this topic when I was a student. However, after much reflection, my views have evolved over the years. As I learned more about the topic, as I came into contact with friends and family affected by abortion, and as I matured and developed my own independent analysis of this most sensitive topic. Crucially for me, I stepped outside the groupthink which I genuinely believe dominates this debate in Ireland. It seems that if you don't succumb to the accepted view that abortion is a liberal issue, a women's rights issue, a cornerstone of the progressive agenda, then you are deemed to be a backward, illiberal, Neanderthal fundamentalist who belongs to a different era. Of course, the distinct irony of this prevailing view is that it is so illiberal in its intolerance of any alternative outlook. Of course, I respect the right of people to campaign for liberal access to abortion. Many of them do not consider abortion to be the intentional ending of human life, and so they simply see it as a medical procedure, which can simply be regarded as a clear-cut choice. And I can appreciate this way of thinking because I used to think that way myself. Carried along with the accepted, supposedly progressive view on abortion, I never considered the other life involved. Of course, because of the huge stress and trauma that surrounds abortion, we know that this medical procedure analogy is a sterile yet dangerous inaccuracy. I think that the vast majority of us know and appreciate that an unborn baby is just that, it is a baby. And if such a baby is born prematurely, we don't simply shrug our shoulders and say this baby has not come to full term. It's merely a fetus and we will not treat it. Of course not. We do everything possible within the bounds of medical science to save that baby's life. We know that baby cannot live independently outside the womb, but that is not a cause to give up on it. This is human life after all, and we must save it. Some say this is a women's issue, that it's about women's rights. Therefore, if you're pro-life, you're obviously anti-women. Yet, when one steps back from the stifling groupthink and reflects, I think that one arrives at a different view. I'm a woman, and I'm very happy to say that I am also very much in favour of women's rights. But by that I mean all women, not just adults or adolescents or children. I mean babies too. The sad reality as we look around the globe at how women's rights are advocated, promoted and defended, it's clear to me that abortion is in fact often a tool for the oppression of women. Look at China, India, Korea, and indeed some parts of Europe and the United States of America. The societal preference for boys over girls has led to the obliteration of tens of millions of baby girls who were simply never born. A famous feature carried by The Economist magazine in 2010 showed just how females are discriminated against in this age of abortion. One paragraph from that edition of The Economist jumped out at me, and I have to say it frightened me, and I'll quote it. Until the 1980s, people in poor countries could do little about this preference. Before birth, nature took its course. But in that decade, ultrasound scanning and other methods of detecting the sex of a child before birth began to make their appearance. These technologies changed everything. Doctors in India started advertising ultrasound scans with the slogan, "Pay 5,000 rupees today and save 50,000 rupees tomorrow." The saving was on the cost of a daughter's dowry. Parents who wanted a son but balked at killing baby daughters chose abortion in their millions. I think it would be bizarre if we as legislators, and hopefully as thinkers, did not ask the obvious question: what is the net difference between such screening, followed by intentional gender-based abortion, and the intentional killing of the baby after delivery? The answer, of course, is none. The net effect is exactly the same, which is to say that an innocent baby is simply wiped out. The scale of this exercise is such that in China, by the year 2020, there will be 30 to 40 million less women than men walking the earth, growing up, having families, going to work, and generally contributing to their society. 30 to 40 million less women is hardly, in my opinion, a triumph for feminism or liberalism. The horror of abortion is also to be seen closer to home. The phenomenon of designer babies is one of the elements which horrifies me the most. This year, we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Special Olympics coming to Ireland. That was an extraordinary occasion which saw children and adults with intellectual disabilities, and particularly Down syndrome, celebrated in this country like never before. In a sense, it marked the end of marginalisation and the beginning of a new era when people with special needs were finally embraced and celebrated as they should be. Many people might not like this juxtaposition of these two issues, but I believe in facing reality. In the United States, a country which initially introduced abortion in extremely limited circumstances, the use of prenatal screening is today absolutely prolific and increasingly acceptable in society. There are many studies charting disturbing trends, but one by Professor F.X. Egan of the University of Connecticut showed that of the 122,519 Down syndrome babies expected to be born between 1989 and 2006, only 65,492 were in fact born. Almost 50% of those babies were simply obliterated because they were not perfect, whatever that means. I find this genuinely terrifying and shocking all at once. It again shows that this question of abortion is not a liberal issue, far from it. In a liberal society, we celebrate life in all its imperfect manifestations. We also celebrate the right of human beings to enjoy life, whether we speak of a criminal on death row, or an innocent baby girl, or a baby with Down syndrome. None of us is perfect, but our life is worthy, and we are all worthy of life. Who is any one of us to determine that one single life is not worth living, not worth protecting? As I say, I didn't stand for elected office to pursue a pro-life agenda. Of course, my view before all of the elections which I have contested was crystal clear and often repeated on many doorsteps in my constituency and indeed on the airwaves. It was, of course, no secret that my party, Fine Gael, was a party which unashamedly defended the right to life and issued repeated statements to that effect over the years, including stridently in advance of the last general election. But I campaigned, as most politicians did in the last election, on a platform which was almost entirely focused on the economic future of our country. For me and for Fine Gael, this was essentially a pro-enterprise agenda concerned with restoring our economic sovereignty and ensuring that we emerge from the shackles of our bailout programme, restoring hope and dignity to our citizens. In the 2 years and nearly 4 months since our government was formed, this is what we in Fine Gael have dedicated ourselves to. And along with the Taoiseach Enda Kenny and all of our ministers, I have worked day and night to contribute to this country's recovery. I certainly don't want to give up on this work. I firmly believe that we still have much to do. The revelation of the Anglo tapes last week reminded me of this. It reminded me once again of the disease and the rot at the heart of the system, which I want to contribute to changing. But what of another type of rot? One which could enshrine in Irish law for the first time ever, and in contravention of our express constitutional obligations, a hierarchy of human being in this state. One which says that we can select who deserves to live and who does not. I've had people contact me in recent months condemning me for having a moral or ethical concern about abortion. Some demanded that I leave my morals or my conscience aside in order to support abortion. and I have to say I find this logic bizarre. There is an emerging consensus in Ireland which suggests that having a sense of morality has something to do with the Catholic Church. It's automatically assumed that if one wishes to consult with one's conscience, that somehow equates to consulting with Rome. This is a lazy way of attempting to undermine the worth of an argument without actually dealing with the substance. This is not just a Catholic issue, any more than it is a Protestant or a Muslim issue. It's not a religious issue, it's a human rights issue. And I wonder what one should consult with when voting on a fundamental human rights issue such as this, if it's not one's own conscience. My personal view is that all I can do when making a decision on life and death, and that is what we are considering here, is consult my conscience, which is based on my sense of what is right and what is wrong. Who else or what else can I consult? The latest opinion poll, the party hierarchy, the editor of the most popular newspaper? I mentioned groupthink, which is a corrosive affliction on this country. We saw it in the Haughey era, we saw it during the Celtic Tiger era, and we see it on this question of abortion. It's easy to understand why people in positions of responsibility want thorny issues to simply disappear. It's far easier than risking conflict, unpopularity, or worse, paying the price for speaking up. Wouldn't the country have been much better served in the 2000s had more people on the government benches, in academia or in the media been prepared to raise their heads above the parapet? I'm sure that there were many conscientious objectors who realised that what was happening was wrong, yet they all remained reticent to avoid the wrath of their colleagues, of the public, of their bosses, of the media, and so on. Conscience lost out, and the country suffered greatly. We all have the right to conscientious objection. It is, in fact, enshrined in Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion." I contend that this freedom of conscience is not just a right, but also a duty. I'd like to just briefly address some of the substance of the bill. Given my misgivings about this bill, I'm hoping that some substantive changes might be accepted to improve the legislation in order to make it compatible with our constitutional obligations as legislators. It's fair to say that Sections 7 and 8 of the bill don't cause me any concern. In fact, I welcome the fact that we will be ensuring certainty for medical practitioners and for pregnant women in the case where there is a real and substantial risk to the life of the mother, in accordance with the test set down by the Supreme Court in X. It's right and proper that all women, including prospective mothers, can benefit from the highest possible standard of care in Irish hospitals. No woman should lose her life through inaction during pregnancy, and I hope and believe that we are all agreed on that. That is surely a pro-life position. However, I'm deeply concerned about the inclusion of the so-called suicide clause in the legislation, which is, of course, Section 9. This, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the vast majority of psychiatrists in the country, is a very worrying step. Not only does it fly in the face of the evidence presented at both hearings of the Oireachtas Health Committee, where the overwhelming view of the medical profession was that suicide could never be a treatment or a solution to suicidal intent, but in addition, this clause has the potential to normalise suicidal ideation by enshrining suicide on our statute book for the first time ever, and that is of major concern to me. The only way to avoid the introduction of this flawed element of the legislation is to omit it entirely from the bill, and I would urge Minister Riley to read and reflect upon the expert psychiatric evidence presented before the Health Committee hearings. I would also ask him to study the joint statement endorsed by 113 Irish psychiatrists who unanimously declared in an alarming but illuminating statement that the suicide clause is simply unworkable. It seems from recent statements from ministers that the government's view is that there can be no term limit on the right to end a pregnancy by inducing delivery. In other words, if a woman's life is in danger and the unborn baby is deemed to be viable, there is an obligation to bring forward delivery in order to save the life of the woman while making all efforts to save the life of the baby. This, of course, has the potential to cause major medical negligence litigation in the future. However, I don't propose to address this point in any detail here. I think others have already made that point cogently. But further to this position, the government has expressed the view that whether a pregnancy can be ended by means of an abortion depends on the gestational stage of the unborn child. In other words, if a fetus is viable, then delivery has to be induced, and an abortion is not permitted. The clear result of all of this is an inherent term limit for abortion within the legislation. If this prohibition on abortion after viability is established, is assumed and indeed articulated publicly by the government, then why not enshrine it in the legislation? The leading authorities on Irish constitutional law, Gerard Hogan and Jerry White, in Kelly's constitution, originally of course authored by former Fine Gael TD and Minister Professor John Kelly, they support this line of argument and go so far as to say, and I quote, that it is disingenuous to suggest that the X case allows abortion up until the point of birth. So logically and legally by this analysis, there is a constitutional term limit already in place, namely the point of viability outside the womb. Both government and the leading academics agree on this point. So given that there is agreement between the government and the leading constitutional lawyers in this state, why should this not be expressly stated in the legislation? I'm very strongly of the view that an amendment to the legislation clarifying and confirming the legal term limit for the carrying out of an abortion is necessary. It's also perfectly constitutional, and further I would argue that it is the absolute minimum protection necessary in a civilised country. Such a provision would give firm legal basis to what is already the interpretation of government, and crucially, I think it would provide some small degree of reassurance to those citizens with genuine concerns about the possibility of abortion up to full term, which, incidentally, does not exist in any jurisdiction to my knowledge, even regimes where liberal abortion on demand exists. They all impose term limits. I'd like to move on to the right to vindicate the constitutional rights of the unborn. I'm entirely perplexed, I have to say, as to why the right to legal representation for the unborn is excluded from this legislation. It is the minimum protection required to be afforded to unborn children. It's important to remember at every step of this legislative process that the unborn child is a human being, a person, and has full rights as such under our Constitution. This means that as a constitutional person, an unborn baby has the exact same right to life as any other living constitutional person. I think this concept can sound a little bit abstract to many people. They might ask, for example, how on earth can an unborn baby with no voice and no capacity benefit from legal representation? However, in reality, and in the pursuit and vindication of human rights, this is absolutely nothing unusual. A baby 1 day old can be represented in the courts, and this happens regularly, for example, in medical negligence cases through the ad litem procedure. Equally, a person of limited mental capacity can be represented in our courts in order to have their rights vindicated. When you think about it, this, of course, it's not a luxury afforded to the most vulnerable people in our society. On the contrary, it is often the only way in which they have their constitutional and human rights vindicated in a world where otherwise they might suffer greatly. I understand that some people do not believe that a fetus is a person, and therefore that it has no legitimate expectation to have its constitutional rights vindicated. This is, however, simply an ideological position. It is not borne out by the law or by our Constitution Bunreacht na hÉireann, which explicitly recognises it as a person and therefore as having the same and equal rights as other people. Now, I can only assume that the logic behind this omission in the bill is a view that legal representation is not warranted on the grounds that a medical decision-making does not warrant consultation with all parties. However, it is hard to think of any other medical procedure or decision where the rights of a third party, and not that directly of the patient, are affected. So surely legal representation is more and not less appropriate in these cases. Decisions made under Section 7 and Section 8 of the bill are purely medical decisions based on empirical evidence. However, Decisions made under Section 9 relating to suicidality are of a different nature. They involve judgments of credibility, veracity and so on by psychiatrists and not simply empirical observation by doctors, and as a result the decisions should be detailed, forensic, investigative and will inevitably take place over a number of days at a minimum. This difference in nature between the decisions to be made under Section 7 and 8 and those under Section 9 was essentially the central point of former DPP Eamon Barnes' recent article in the Irish Times. These decisions are also quasi-judicial in nature because of the panel system, so surely the unborn should be represented in that scenario. It's impossible to justify a situation whereby the unborn, a constitutional person...
I have to interrupt you. Your time has expired.
Okay.
Unless the House is prepared to agree that you finish your script.
Thank you.
Is that agreed?
Thank you. Appreciate that, Ceann Comhairle and members. Thank you. It's impossible to justify a situation whereby the unborn, a constitutional person, would be prohibited from being represented in front of these panels when grown adults, also constitutional persons, are entitled to such representation in front of similar such panels where decisions have a profound impact on their rights, and, for example, for illustration purposes, in front of mental health tribunals under the Mental Health Act 2001. So there are other precedents for this. Furthermore, it's arguable that the Attorney-General has a constitutional obligation to act when there is a public interest in vindicating rights which are identified in the Constitution. This is acknowledged in much case law as a privileged role of the Attorney-General. The Supreme Court has specifically recognised this role in relation to Article 43(3), the right to life, as per Judge Finlay in the X case. This right or duty of the Attorney-General is inherent in the Constitution and therefore should be articulated in the bill. Furthermore, under the Constitution, all interested or potentially affected parties to a legal process must be given a right to express their point of view, i.e. the fundamental constitutional right of participation. Both sides of any case must be heard. That is a very well-established principle, constitutional law principle. This was reinforced recently by the Supreme Court itself in the case Delway Investments Ltd versus NAMA in 2001. Clearly, the right to life of the unborn is capable of being directly affected in a material way by a decision taken under Section 9 under the formula given in Delway. Since this is a constitutional principle, it is implied into all statutes. It seems likely that the legislation could be successfully challenged on the grounds that no specific mechanism is in place for the position of the unborn, a constitutional person, to be advocated or a means for them to vindicate their rights. Ceann Comhairle, you'll be pleased to know I'm moving on to my conclusion. I have mentioned some key areas in which this legislation, I believe, needs to be amended. I know that Minister Riley has stated his intention to accept amendments during the committee stage. I take him at his word, and I assume that this means substantive amendments based on evidence and not just procedural ones. If this bill is to genuinely live up to its title, the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Bill, then it should simply aspire to do just that, provide protection to all lives, no more, no less. It must protect women whose lives may be in danger during pregnancy. We expect and demand that this be the case. It must also protect the lives of babies in pregnancy. Otherwise, the title will simply be misleading. Ireland is a great country for mothers and babies where the best possible care has been and continues to be afforded. This bill has the potential to change that and to change the compassionate culture of care which we have treasured for so long. Before I conclude, Ceann Comhairle, I just want to read an email which I received last night which really struck me, I have to say, and to me it sums up the essence of the problem with the bill, and it was sent to me from a psychiatrist. And she said, "Dear Ms Creighton, my name is Dr. Y. I am a psychiatrist for the last 10 years and I'm also a woman and a mother. I have experienced both depression and pregnancy. From all these perspectives, I ask you to think long and hard before the vote on the Life and Pregnancy Bill and to discuss your concerns with your party colleagues. Suicidality is not an easy diagnosis to make. It is dynamic, not static, with the matters contributing to the suicidal state constantly changing. There is absolutely no test one can make to predict whether someone will die by suicide. Finding out one is pregnant for all the wrong reasons is a devastating, life-altering thing. But as human beings, we try to help people adjust and make decisions in a clearer frame of mind. Abortion has never been a treatment for suicidal ideation, and completed abortion may end up being one of those dynamic factors that pushes someone to contemplate suicide. There is nothing so devastating as guilt to the depressed mind. Two wrongs don't make a right. Please consider diverting energy and resources to supporting people with unwanted pregnancies, not pushing them down a path that may be detrimental to their mental health later when it is too late. Thank you for reading this, Dr. Y. Obviously, I've inserted the Y. This, to me, sums up very well why this legislation, as currently framed, is considered unworkable by so many experts. I've had countless, and I mean this genuinely, countless emails and letters from concerned psychiatrists, particularly in the last few weeks. I've not received a single letter, believe it or not, from a psychiatrist welcoming this bill or saying that it's necessary to deal with suicidal intent. Not one. Compassionate clinical care is what is needed, and my firm belief is that the government should put all possible resources into providing this for young, vulnerable women. Abortion solves nothing. I know a number of women who've had abortions and deeply regretted it. I genuinely don't know any woman who's had a baby and regretted it. No matter the circumstances, the initial stress, anxiety, fear, stigma or concern, all of which are genuine, we must support women in their hour of need. That is simply our moral and our constitutional duty. Thank you.
Thank you.